I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, unmasking the RCMP's decades-long surveillance campaign of Indigenous peoples.
The Mounties called it the Native Extremism Program, a secret program of penetration, neutralization, and human source development of extensive scope.
This was an unnecessary, dangerous times.
An enduring impact.
You know, when you start checking under the bed and behind your nightstand.
Rocked by resistance in the 1970s, the Canadian government responded.
This didn't look like just monitoring for potential violent threats. This was a counterinsurgency program.
Revealed in newly declassified, self-styled racial intelligence files, this is how the RCMP Security Service spied on Indigenous movements for years.
It was very invasive.
I knew from a very young age to be careful.
That was the voice of Brett Forster, an Anishinaabe journalist with CBC Indigenous. And what you just heard was a clip from Forster and the CBC Investigates team's groundbreaking investigation into the RCMP's Native Extremism Program. Nearly 6,000 pages of RCMP Secret Service documents obtained by CBC Investigates tell a story about how the RCMP infiltrated Indigenous groups and spied on Indigenous leaders for decades. Leaders like George Manuel, the former head of the National Indian Brotherhood, now known as the Assembly of First Nations.
George Manuel wasn't a militant, but he wasn't a typical politician either.
When you find 90% of our Indian people in Canada who are in welfare, people who are starving in a very rich country in Canada, to me, is a form of subtle genocide.
Manuel led the National Indian Brotherhood, known today as the Assembly of First Nations, from 1970 to 1976. He was leading the resistance to Trudeau's plan to assimilate Indigenous people into the mainstream. First, they observed him. Then they tracked him. They gave him a target number, D937-8819. Then came the infiltration, informers in his inner circle for 5 years straight. Described as a reliable source, well acquainted with the National Indian Brotherhood, the infiltrator was code-numbered A-828.
So now that the documents have been declassified, what do Indigenous leaders and organizations who were surveilled in this program have to say? And what needs to be done to hold Canada and the RCMP accountable? Journalist Brett Forster joins me now with a behind-the-scenes look at the investigation. Brett, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to start, Brett, it took nearly 4 years for the CBC to get access to the RCMP's Native Extremism Program files. Where did the fight for this story kind of all begin?
The fight for these documents actually begins back in 2020. So if you think back to that time, this was a tumultuous time. There were many land-back actions going on across the country. So you can think first in Wet'suwet'en territory, where there was a blockade, an occupation against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. That led to a wave of solidarity protests across the country. Later in 2020, that summer, there was the land-back occupation in Caledonia near Six Nations of the Grand River territory. It was called 1492 Land-back Lane. I was actually working for APTN News at that time. So I covered that dispute. And I learned later that the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Canada's spy agency, was concerned about that particular occupation. I later obtained a declassified version of a CSIS report that said the agency had notable concerns about critical infrastructure. So I was pretty surprised by that, and it made me curious. I thought, if this is what's going on today, if Canada's intelligence agencies today are still concerned these sorts of actions could constitute a threat to national security, what were they saying in the past? I found out very little research had been done on that subject, so I basically had to start from square one and set out from scratch. So that's what I did.
And so the program that you're looking into is called the Native Extremism Program. And I'm wondering, according to the RCMP, what was the sort of impetus behind this program?
So you have to rewind a little bit to the 1960s, the late 1960s, and what the RCMP Security Service described as the radical ferment of the 1960s. This was the time when the American Civil Rights Movement was in full swing, the Black Power movement was making its presence known in the United States, and the Red Power movement was starting to build up both in the United States and then soon in Canada. Meanwhile, the Pierre Trudeau government has tabled its white paper, this policy plan to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the mainstream. This was a plan to get rid of the Indian Act, get rid of treaties, get rid of the reserve system, and basically just achieve total assimilation. So all this is happening. At the RCMP Security Service, they're setting up something called a racial intelligence section. This was modeled on the FBI's racial intelligence section, which was set up in 1968 to spy on civil rights activists. This was the unit that was actually responsible for the surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. So it seems that the RCMP Security Service sees what the FBI is doing, and it sets up its own version of this program explicitly to monitor Black and Indigenous activists in Canada. So now the National Indian Brotherhood enters the stage in 1969. George Manuel gets elected in 1970. Suddenly, they become a prime area of interest for this new RCMP racial intelligence program. Fast forward to 1973, the American Indian movement, the Red Power movement, lands on the scene in Canada with the occupation of the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. 200 youth activists crash the building, they storm it, they take it over for 24 hours. It's completely peaceful, it's nonviolent. But the RCMP Security Service, the predecessor of CSIS, describes itself later in a secret internal history as being, quote, unprepared and unable to respond to government requests for intelligence. In that secret history from later, the Security Service said this incident convinced it to, quote, embark on an extensive program of human source development. What does that mean? That means informant recruitment. After 1973, the RCMP Security Service set out to recruit informers across the Indigenous rights movement. That's when the infiltration began.
And so, as you mentioned about informants, your investigation revealed that the Mounties were employing these informants to surveil Indigenous leaders and organizations. What were some of the groups and movements that they were surveilling?
Target number one was the American Indian movement in Canada. AIM was well known for the occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. This was a 71-day armed confrontation. It resulted in some fatalities, and the RCMP Security Service was deeply concerned, maybe even paranoid, about AIM spreading its influence north into Canada. They devoted a lot of resources to stopping AIM. They really worked to disrupt AIM's movements in Canada. They actually deployed an informer, a delicately placed source, as they described it, who spent, quote, considerable time moving throughout the Indigenous community in Toronto, where local activists were setting up an AIM movement. So AIM was target number one, and arguably there were some justifiable concerns, right? AIM picked up arms and engaged in confrontation with the United States. It would arguably, again, be a legitimate thing for the security service to monitor. But after that, target number two was the Assembly of First Nations predecessor, known as the National Indian Brotherhood at the time. Even back then, that was considered a moderate organization. It wasn't led by militants. The people leading it, George Manuel, the national chief, wasn't engaged in any sort of protests, occupations, militancy, or armed confrontation. He was building a people's movement. He was advocating for change, for Indigenous people's right to self-determination through legitimate means. They were target number two. Why would they have been considered extreme? Why would the Native Extremism Program target NIB? Well, at the time, the Mounties considered demanding self-determination to be extreme. If you opposed residential schooling, for example, and advocated for First Nations control over First Nations education, as George Manuel did they would consider that to be extreme. These ideas are totally normal today. They're, in fact, part of the constitutional fabric of Canada, largely because of what those leaders did back then. But in 1970, 1973, it seemed radical to the Mounties. After that, the Dene Nation in the Northwest Territories replaced the National Indian Brotherhood as target number 2 for the very same reasons. The Dene Declaration advocated for self-determination. And then after that, target number 3 were provincial associations like the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan, national Métis associations like the Native Council of Canada, Inuit national organizations, local organizations. The list just went on and on after that.
Many of the Indigenous leaders that you spoke with for this story weren't really surprised that the state was spying on them. Why weren't they surprised?
They knew about some of it. So think about George Erasmus, for example. He was the president of the Dene Nation in the late 1970s. He later went on to lead the Assembly of First Nations, as well as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. He knew this was happening. He told me that the RCMP Security Service agent in Yellowknife would just park across the street from the Dene Nation office in Yellowknife and just take pictures. He would just sit in the back of the car with a telephoto lens snapping pictures of members of the organization. You couldn't miss him. He wasn't being very covert or discreet. You could tell it was going on. That was actually a tactic I learned later. If you know you're being watched, you're less likely to do something quote unquote subversive. So that was number 1. And he told me that when he would travel to Edmonton from Yellowknife, they would stop him and give him a hard time at the airport as if he was smuggling contraband into another country or something like that. So he knew this was happening, but even Erasmus had no idea about the covert efforts. He had no idea that in 1978, the RCMP Security Service had 5 paid informers targeted specifically against the Dene Nation. In Yellowknife, I went to Yellowknife, I broke that news to him, and he described himself as astounded. He had no idea this was happening, and he wanted to know why. After he thought about it for a little bit, he came up with an answer. And the answer was that the Canadian government considered him to be an enemy of the state. He was a legitimate First Nations leader seeking change, but he was viewed at the time, in his mind, today as an enemy of the state.
So another person that you spoke with was Métis leader Tony Belcourt, who was the founding president of the Native Council of Canada back in the 70s. And I'm going to play a clip from your story of what he had to say.
Where was there any regard for our rights as just citizens, to privacy, to be able to speak freely? Well, supposed to have freedom of expression. Where were those rights being recognized and honored by the Crown?
So when you spoke with Tony and other leaders, what rights did they feel were violated through this program?
Indigenous leaders like Tony Belcourt and researchers felt strongly that their Indigenous rights, their human rights, their civil rights, their rights to privacy were all violated by this program. Tony Belcourt's comments highlight just how undemocratic this program was. We spoke with leading researchers who also described it as a significant breach of Canada's democratic principles, even as they existed in 1975. This was before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, but Canada still held itself out to be a democracy at that time. This story is a reminder that those democratic rights were not always afforded to Indigenous peoples. We didn't have the right to assemble. We didn't have the right to hire lawyers. We couldn't file land claims for several years until they lifted the most draconian restrictions under the Indian Act in 1951. We couldn't even vote until 1960. The Indian residential school system and day school system were in full swing at this time. So this program, the surveillance and attempts to disrupt political organizing, aren't surprising in a way, they continue these patterns that had been demonstrated in other areas in Canadian society. It's not surprising that this happened, given all those other things that were going on. What's surprising to me is that it took 50 years to get the proof.
And so I want to kind of go back to the behind the scenes work of, putting the story together over the course of nearly 4 years. I'm wondering, what was your experience navigating the access to information request system, completing the story?
It was a battle. So, as I said before, this started in 2022. That's when I filed my first request for the dossier on the National Indian Brotherhood. I have some of it here. It's an old, dusty, faded folder with the words racial intelligence stamped on it. And they ignored that request. It just disappeared. No one ever followed up. No one ever sent me an email. So I followed up again in 2023 and filed the identical request. I just filed the same request for the dossier on the Brotherhood. They got back to me that time saying they needed an additional 1,398 days, or 42 months, or almost 4 years to process that request. The reason they were giving was that they needed to consult with CSIS to review the records for potential national security concerns. They were claiming that they needed 4 years to review these documents to prevent potential harm to Canada's national security. I disputed that. I was very suspicious of that claim. So I filed a complaint to the Information Commissioner, which is the ombud that investigates and forces organizations and departments to live up to their obligations under the Access to Information Act. The commissioner sided with me. She agreed the delay was unreasonable and ordered the government to promptly release the dossier. But the Minister of Canadian Heritage intervened and actually filed a court challenge. The minister filed a court challenge aiming to uphold this original 4-year delay. I represented myself in court. I cross-examined the government's witness, filed legal arguments, and as we approached a hearing, probably with less than a month left, the government relented. I got the documents in my inbox, and they swiftly abandoned their court case. So I had 3 more requests, and we had to repeat that process in those other instances. So there were 4 access to information requests, 4 successful complaints to the commissioner. 3 of those led to court cases, which were started, then abandoned by the federal government. We never got to argue it out in court. So I still believe, based on that experience, that really the Canadian government just did not want the public to see this material. The government arguably just wanted to delay release as long as possible.
And so now that the investigation has been published, how has the RCMP responded?
At first, the RCMP did not want to comment, and the RCMP officially declined to comment on any of these historical matters. Then we published our investigation, and in less than 2 days, the Mounties had changed their position. The RCMP commissioner has issued a statement of quote-unquote sincere regret for this program and has promised to meet with interested Indigenous leaders, elders, and subjects of this surveillance to discuss a way forward. So that's a pretty significant and swift change in tone from the Mounties. After that was published, some Indigenous organizations continued to speak out, saying an expression of regret is not really an apology. Is it an apology if it doesn't include the words, "we are sorry for this"? Others are still looking for an apology from the government, the federal government, the elected officials. A program like this, we were able to learn that the elected Liberal government of Pierre Trudeau actually approved wiretaps at the National Indian Brotherhood headquarters. So it wasn't just the Mounties coming up with this on their own. The elected government of the day was implicated, and some leaders want to see the government apologize as well.
And kind of related to that, at a recent press conference, Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked if the RCMP should explicitly apologize for the spying program, and I'm going to play a clip of his response.
The RCMP commissioner has said he regrets an extensive spying program that targeted hundreds of Indigenous people. Should the RCMP explicitly apologize for what went on?
I didn't see. I
apologize. I haven't seen his exact comments. Yes, there should be an apology. I would have. I didn't see the full comment that he made, but Commissioner Duhem is a good person, and as you would expect, as the commissioner, and I believe that was the intent of what he said. But I apologize. I haven't seen the specifics. But obviously, it's reprehensible practice. Never should have happened. Never would happen.
So, there's been calls for apologies, but I'm wondering, is there a sense that action will follow these calls for apologies at all?
From what I've been hearing in reaction to the Prime Minister and Commissioner's comments, there is not a lot of confidence in the potential for an apology to bring changed actions. I think a lot of folks feel that there needs to be an accounting for this program first. An apology would be perhaps a first step, but we still have only scratched the surface of what this program actually did. There are still many more dossiers classified within the National Archives here in Ottawa. We obtained 4 intelligence files. Just those 4 dossiers contain 6,000 pages of paper. We believe there could be up to 30 more dossiers on basically every Indigenous organization that existed then. Many of them still exist today. There could be up to 75,000 to 100,000 pages of paper within Library and Archives Canada that relate to this program. Many of the organizations that still exist today had dossiers on them that haven't been released. So the Métis National Council was represented by the Native Council of Canada, Tony Belcourt, and others. The Native Council of Canada's file has not been released. The Manitoba Métis Federation, their file has not been released. The Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, their file has not been released. I'm still fighting to get the file released on the FSIN, and I was told it would take a long time to release that one too. So is there any way to get a full accounting of this program first? If you don't understand the history, how are you going to ensure it doesn't happen again? I've learned many people believe this is still going on. When we were doing interviews across the country, we heard pretty much every single time that the targets feel this is still happening. They still feel there is politically and racially motivated surveillance targeting Indigenous movements in Canada. We asked a senior official at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service if that agency still pays informers to spy on groups like the Assembly of First Nations. She told us that CSIS does not investigate lawful dissent, but Indigenous leaders believe CSIS still monitors it.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of brings me into another question. Regardless if CSIS, isn't giving details or won't kind of speak to this, in what ways does the surveillance of Indigenous groups, sort of continue to this day that we see, playing out?
It's a good question. There are a few important things to highlight. Number one, the RCMP Security Service was disbanded and replaced with CSIS. CSIS actually restarted this program in 1988. CSIS reignited the Native Extremism Program in 1988, largely based on the same Cold War suspicions about foreign interference in the Indigenous rights movement. They were targeting the Innu of Labrador. And CSIS ran this program till at least 1999, and that's just where my inquiries have stopped. That's just where the documents and paper trail has stopped. It's possible this program, this monitoring and surveillance, continued at CSIS long past that. They won't confirm or deny it. Meanwhile, when the security service was abolished, the RCMP still retained its criminal intelligence gathering function. So the RCMP is still responsible for monitoring potential quote-unquote criminal threats. And we saw that in something like Project Sitka. That was a recent operation by the criminal side of the RCMP, where they were, again, monitoring Indigenous activists as quote-unquote criminal threats to the country. So that's evidence in modern times of that still happening. There have been some major criticisms leveled at the RCMP's Community Industry Response Group. That's been rebranded. Since a lot of that controversy surfaced, that unit was under systemic investigation by the RCMP's watchdog agency, and still is as we speak. That report, we are told, is finished, and it can't be released because the watchdog agency, the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, currently doesn't have a commissioner. It's vacant, so they can't sign off on that report. So we are waiting for a report today to describe to what extent a unit like that was engaged in this sort of surveillance and countering activity targeting Indigenous activism.
In the aftermath of this investigation, what are some of the calls to action that have been forwarded by Indigenous leaders and the people that you interviewed in this investigation?
There have been some mixed feelings. Some of the targets we spoke to just shrugged off the idea of an apology. They just said, what is it going to achieve if nothing changes? There have also been calls for transparency. Some are calling for public hearings. They want the documents to be made public as much as can be possible. They want apologies, and they want answers from the government about how this happened. It also raises the question of trust going forward. I've seen a few press releases and a few statements that cite Bill C-5. This is Prime Minister Mark Carney's law to fast track major developments and major projects. There are groups raising concerns right now that they could be labeled national security threats if they decide to oppose one of these projects that's being deemed in the national interest. I think that's partly why this story is striking a chord. People see those same issues that were contentious in the 1970s resurfacing. One of the things that made the Dene Nation a top target in the late 1970s was their organized resistance to the proposed Mackenzie Valley pipeline project. This was a pipeline that was going to bring gas from Alaska through the north, through Canada to the United States. They opposed it. They wanted their land rights recognized first. They wanted their Aboriginal title recognized first. They made their claims in the courts, and they did a significant job opposing it. That made them threats to national unity in the eyes of the RCMP Security Service and potentially the broader government of Canada. So we're seeing issues like that resurface with a lot of speculative talk about new pipelines. So these aren't yesterday's issues. These issues matter today. There are echoes of what went on in the 1970s ringing out today.
So Brett, my last question for you, there are thousands more files in the Library and Archives of Canada on other Indigenous leaders and organizations. And I'm wondering, do you plan on digging deeper into these files?
I plan to do a little bit more digging. However, it's also difficult when it takes so long and so many resources just to get one dossier. My hopes are that now that this program is out of the shadows, others will see that there's value here and pick up the search. Some of the organizations impacted might be able to request unredacted access to these papers. The ones we have obtained are available online on the website of Library and Archives Canada. You can email them and they will direct you to the right links. So there are ways people can access these documents that have already been released. There are very easy ways you can request new dossiers, including on yourself if you were a member of one of these political organizations back in the 1970s. That's one important point to really stress. If you were an Indigenous leader or an activist in the 1970s and involved in a political association, there is a very good chance that the RCMP Security Service had a file on that organization. The RCMP Security Service considered any Indigenous organization as a potentially subversive organization. So it's possible that there's a dossier on it within the archives. There is tremendous public importance in releasing these in a timely manner. The targets are now elders. They deserve some closure about this. In many ways, they've found the release gratifying because they have found that they weren't paranoid. It's true. The RCMP really was deploying spies and paid informers to infiltrate the Indigenous rights movement in the 1970s. These papers confirm allegations that have went unproven for the last 50 years. And we've only scratched the surface of what actually remains within the archives. There's tremendous interest. This could be of profound value to historians. It's also important to note that this program relied on many of the same justifications as the other colonial and assimilationist programs of the day. The Indian residential school system and day school system were based on the stereotypical ideology, the stereotypical idea that Indigenous peoples could not think for themselves and needed the state to step in and manage their affairs. This RCMP Racial Intelligence and Native Extremism Program relied on the same stereotype. It relied on the same idea that Indigenous people needed protecting, in this case from communists or hostile outside forces, and couldn't think for themselves. Every Indigenous leader and researcher we interviewed throughout this project described that idea as racist.
Brett, thank you so much for your time and sharing a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at this really incredible investigation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Brett Forster is an Anishinaabe journalist for CBC Indigenous and the former host of Nation to Nation on APTN. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email your suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.